There's an increasing number of HDMI 2.1 monitors that are appearing on the market, and here the AOC AG324UX is a 4K 144Hz monitor with two HDMI 2.1 ports. Now in this review we're going to be seeing if it's actually worth its price tag and how it compares to its competitors, because it can be found in the UK for a whopping £900. So jumping straight in, we're going to talk about its gaming performance, and first off I do want to talk about input lag, because this will be of very much importance to console and PC gamers alike. Now in my test using CSGO, which is of course playing on PC, I noted that the input lag was very low. Specifically given the monitor has a low input lag mode, which you'll definitely want to enable through the OSD, here you'll find your op flicks or your clicks will very much be responsive on the panel. For a 4K 144Hz panel, I was definitely left impressed. However, the same couldn't be quite said about its response time. Now the monitor does have a variety of different overdrive modes to select from, and if you were to lob it in its strongest or its boost mode overdrive, which also does limit peak brightness as a little side note, here you'll find that the monitor does respond pretty well, but then does suffer from a lot of overshoot ghosting, which is purple trailing, and therefore will throw off your shots. Even in a potato looking game such as CSGO, you will notice these purple trails and this overshoot ghosting, which will really throw you off from using the monitor altogether. As such, if you're going to be using this monitor, be it in a hardcore FPS game such as CSGO or Valorant or even Call of Duty to a certain extent, I would very much suggest you to run the medium overdrive mode. And yes, this means that you're getting a slower response time of the monitor, but then you're getting a much more visually appealing monitor that you can actually use and potentially not even throw off your shots because you're seeing a lot of purple trailing around enemy heads. Now, this does mean that the monitor's response time isn't that impressive and can't quite compete with other monitors out there on the market, specifically those 4K 144Hz monitors that don't have HDMI 2.1 support, or for example monitors which are just, well, not 4K monitors and therefore are aimed for the more competitive scene, such as 144Hz or 240Hz, 1440p or 1080p monitors that you can find out there. What I'm trying to say ultimately is that the gaming performance is decent, but you should just be mindful of the relatively poor response time of the monitor. Now elsewhere, AOC have incorporated MBR, where you've got 20 level increments to choose from, and in its maximum level, in other words level 20, it's pretty dim. In other words, the monitor gets to around 95 nits, which is similar to what you'd get in the boost mode overdrive. Now here what I will say is that the overall MBR does do what it says on the tin, but the only thing to be mindful about is that unlike some of its competitors, it doesn't have the technology to run MBR modes simultaneously with adaptive sync. In other words, you can't run AMD FreeSync and or NVIDIA G-Sync while running on MBR mode, which might throw off certain gamers. Now my disappointments with the monitor don't just stop there, because its HDR support is somewhat laughable. HDR 400 at a £900 price tag is completely unacceptable, at least to me. Here you can find monitors with HDR 600 or even HDR 1000 support instead, and in this respect this AOC monitor gets absolutely trumped in this department. Indeed, Destiny 2 did look a little bit better with HDR, but it's not exactly night and day, and it's really not something to be shouting about. Its HDR support is just there for, well, HDR compliancy, but other than that I just really wouldn't use HDR altogether, and in some respects even might throw you off in terms of how it looks like, because the sheer peak brightness limitations of this monitor kind of put it down. Now moving on, we get onto AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA G-Sync. Now it's worth bearing in mind that this monitor does not have a built-in G-Sync module, so therefore PC gamers can't benefit from the full VRR range, in other words from 1 to 144Hz, if they're running an NVIDIA graphics card. However, for those who have an AMD graphics card, and indeed those people who are console gamers such as Xbox gamers, you'll be pleased to know that you can run a tear-free gaming experience from 48Hz to 144Hz. Now in my case, I have an RTX 2080 Super, I was connected over DisplayPort, and I had no problems running G-Sync simultaneously with HDR at 4K and 144Hz, and I had no sort of artifacts or problem while playing Destiny 2. Of course, do bear in mind my comments I made before with HDR, but when it comes to a G-Sync compatibility support, well, at least in my case, it does work. Now with the gaming section out of the way, we get onto image quality, and here the monitor has a 31.5-inch IPS panel, and it runs at 4K 144Hz. Put across my Datacolor SpiderX Elite, I noted a 99.1% sRGB gamut coverage and a 103.8% gamut volume. You can see here how it compares to the sRGB standard. Now color accuracy is stupendously impressive, with an average delta E of 0.84 and a maximum of 2.26. Contrast ratio was also pretty impressive at 970:1, at least for my calibrator. What I'll say here is the sRGB mode is seriously impressive, at least when you select it through the OSD. The only thing worth bearing in mind is that it will limit peak brightness. So if you take it outside of this sRGB mode, it's no surprise that the overall average delta does drop. In other words, it gets higher at 1.97 and a maximum of 5.12. This is again no surprise, but gamers will pretty much not be too bothered about this because the warm mode still does give you a pretty nice image. So what did I have it tested when it came to sRGB mode? Well, I noted 118 nits, which is pretty dim in my opinion. In terms of peak brightness, however, it rises to 334 nits, and as for minimum brightness, it's 87 nits. If you were to run it in terms of MBR mode, in terms of its maximum MBR mode, or in terms of boost overdrive, this will limit it to 95 nits, and again will take away those brightness controls. Something to be mindful of. But what about in terms of brightness uniformity? And here the monitor falls short yet again. The overall brightness uniformity will of course depend in terms of your panel, it's somewhat lottery, but in my case the top right side was not that impressive. Again here, when it came to backlight bleed, the IPS panel did suffer from some, and while it's perfectly acceptable in my opinion, for those gamers who do play a lot of dark games or indeed watching such as dark movies, you might want to look at a VA panel instead, which is somewhat rare to come across when it comes to a 4K 144Hz panel. And now we get on to the monitor's OSD, and here you can access the G menu, which is a software-based OSD that allows you to tinker around with some of the RGB lights which are positioned around the monitor. Indeed, this monitor has downward and backward firing RGB lights. They're not exactly that bright, but they're there for your convenience. In my case, I completely have them disabled. Now moving past this, we're going to get to the hardware based OSD, which can be accessed through a joystick button found behind the monitor or indeed via a little puck. Now jumping straight into the light effects, because that is the RGB lights which reside around the monitor, you can enable it, disable it, and change the pattern and or the colors. As I mentioned, I don't use it, nor do I see the point in it, so I completely leave it disabled. There is also a logo projection which appears underneath the monitor, and yet again I don't really see the point of this unless you're a hardcore AOC or Agon fan. I suspect most people were going to actually completely disable it. But on the plus side, you can adjust the RGB values, so tinker around with the color settings. But moving into more important settings, here you've got the game settings. Now I did reference before the MBR mode can't be simultaneously used with the adaptive sync, so if you do want to use it, you'll have to use one or the other. You can see adaptive sync is disabled, and therefore I can adjust the MBR value. As for the overdrive, as I did reference, the medium mode is my suggested mode. A strong and boost mode just incur too much overshoot ghosting. Low input lag mode, leave that enabled at all times, and quick switch LED is the LED light that resides around the little puck that I just referenced. As for the HDMI, that's to do in terms of the amount of frequency you can get, so therefore 120 Hz or 144 Hz. Of course, this really depends if you've got a console or not, or indeed a PC, but if you're running a PC, I'd probably suggest running a DisplayPort cable to it in order to enable DSC as well. Now as for luminance, this obviously depends on terms of your own ambient light conditions. The only thing worth bearing in mind over here is the HDR modes. I wouldn't suggest enabling this on an SDR image, but if you're running an HDR image, then you'll see display HDR also pop up over here, and that's the mode that I would suggest if you're running a HDR signal. Hopefully that makes sense. Then you've got pip settings which you can enable and play around with, and then you've got the color setup, and here you've got the different color temperatures. Warm will pretty much suffice for most gamers. If you're a color editor or video editor, you probably want to go on the sRGB mode. Of course, you've got the user mode as well, where you can adjust the RGB values, but just worth bearing in mind that the sRGB mode does lock the peak brightness, as I did reference before. Now as for audio, it's actually pretty impressive. It's got two 8-watt speakers which actually are pretty good, and while I normally don't suggest speakers for a monitor, in other words use set of bookshelf speakers or headphones, I do like the actual sound quality that you can get from this monitor, which isn't something I normally say. Now here it also has DTS sound, so I would suggest running the game mode for you to get the best overall frequency, but you can adjust the frequencies if you disable DTS and go for your own setup. Now with the monitor's OSD out of the way, let's get onto the stand and design, and here I really do like its 3-side borderless design, but other than that I'm not too fan of what AOC have done over here. Aside from the actual looks of the monitor, the stand in my opinion is way too large. It's something that I've commented on other recent AOC monitors, and I just really don't like its stand. It doesn't actually fit properly on my IKEA Freddy desk. Now, if you don't have a shelf or a monitor riser, then this won't be a problem. And of course, if you don't want to use the built-in stand, you can use a VESA compatible stand, so in other words, a monitor arm instead, in order to replace or somewhat alleviate this problem. Now, on the subject of the stand, it does provide you height, tilt, pivot, and can be rotated, which is also great to see. And as for the rear of the monitor, you do have a little headphone stand which can be propped out, and also the stand has got a handle, just in case you just wanted and fancied to take a 31.5-inch monitor with you on the go. And finally, we get onto connectivity, and here the monitor has a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input with DSC support, and therefore means that you're not getting any chroma subsampling and you get the full RGB support. However, the same couldn't be quite said, at least according to some, for its HDMI ports. Yes, they run on the 2.1 stand and therefore can output 4K at 120Hz to a console, or indeed 144Hz to a PC, of course if you've got a compatible graphics card with an HDMI 2.1 port. However, when it comes to the chroma subsampling, as far as I'm aware, or at least according to Simon at TFT Central and Adam at PC Monitors, these guys also have said and kind of pointed out to me that the HDMI ports have got a limited bandwidth, and they're waiting for comment from AOC. And of course, if I get that comment, of course I will pop it down in the description below, and or link to the appropriate reviews and or articles from these two legends. Now, I should also point out that this monitor has a USB Type-C input and therefore has 90 watts of power delivery as well. So therefore you can simultaneously use this monitor as a secondary display and also charge your laptop. And no problems in terms of charging my laptop, but while using it as a monitor, well, I wasn't able to display anything on the monitor while connected to my Microsoft Surface Go. Now, I'm not really sure if that's to do with the overall resolution or anything to do with the setup or indeed the cables, because I did try several different cables and it ultimately didn't work. But this also does really lead me into the KVM switch capabilities, because I couldn't test it. The KVM switch basically means that you can connect up, let's say, a laptop to your monitor and then also a computer to your monitor via a, let's say, DisplayPort and also a USB Type-B to Type-A cable, and then use your mouse and keyboard while plugged into the monitor directly. I mean, you can switch between sources while still using the same peripherals, which is quite handy, meaning that you don't have to faff around with connectivity and or having to unplug certain peripherals and put them into a different source. But again, all I'm just trying to say over here is that it should have this capability, but I couldn't quite test it. And so this brings me on to my verdict. Would I recommend the AOC AG324UX? Well, quite frankly, it's a hard no from me, and I don't say that quite often. The reason behind it is because if you're a console gamer, you're going to be looking for better HDR support and or HDMI ports which aren't limited. And as such here, I would recommend looking at the Asus PG32UQ instead, which comes in at £850, at least at the time of review, versus the £900 that AOC are asking for this HDR 400 monitor. Look past this, and if you're not a console gamer and you don't care about HDMI 2.1, you just want a 4K 144Hz IPS panel, well, if you don't mind downgrading or downsizing, shall I say, from 31.5-inch down to 28-inch, consider the other AOC monitor, which comes in at £500, and it's the U28G2XU, which quite frankly is a fantastic buy for the money. Elsewhere, you might want to also consider the Asus ROG Strix XG271UP as well, which is also a similarly impressive 4K panel. And thus, I don't really understand why people would buy the AOC AG324UX, specifically at its price point. Even if the price were to drop drastically, console gamers will look for HDR 600 support and therefore not consider this AOC monitor in the first place, and then elsewhere, PC gamers would only potentially consider the 324UX if they wanted a larger form factor over the 28-inch or 27-inch alternatives that you can find out there on the market. Now, the reviews of all these monitors I've mentioned will be down in the description below, so I do suggest checking them out. And of course, down there you'll find links to my social media platform, and yes, that's a shameless plug, so do follow me on Instagram and Twitter, it'd be greatly appreciated. And of course, if you enjoy detailed independent reviews like this one and want to see more, drop a like, subscribe and hit that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.